Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jenny Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
We are just a few days away from
Mhm.
Memorial Day,
Which
which
snuck
means
up really, really, really quickly.
I know I was just having this conversation at work yesterday where we were just like, May, the month of May has just flown by. Like it felt like a very long winter this year.
Yes, it did.
and and yes, I was busy all winter long and into the spring and everything, but man, May just went. I
Oh
don't know
yeah,
where
because
it went.
we're doing a Civil War. I'm sorry, we're doing a Memorial Day event. I'm stuck on the Civil War. Um, a Memorial Day event on Monday, and I was thinking, oh, I have one more week to really promote it. And somebody, where I was texting somebody else that we're going to start something at the cemetery. She says, "Well, I'll see you Monday." I go, "Why?" And she goes, "For Memorial Day," and I went, "Oh, oh
Yeah,
goodness."
it's here already. Yeah, I
Yeah.
hadn't even thought about it. So it means a 3-day weekend for a lot of us. um so this is our Memorial Day episode because it's important to Diane and I that we, one, being a cemetery podcast, it's a topic that we can easily talk
Right.
about. But two, we want to make sure that we remember why we get this 3-day
Mhm.
weekend here in America. For this is for our American listeners, obviously, in this case. So while I am looking forward to not having to go to work on Monday, um,
You can
there's
come
some
down and
very
join me.
I could actually. There's some very important things we have to discuss and some things we want to remember. So that is today's episode. And then, real quick, next week, so May 29th, I believe, is next Thursday. We will not have a new episode next week. And it's mostly because our producer, who does all of our editing and everything, my husband Dave, he will actually be out of town that week. And I decided I didn't want to make him try and, I mean, I can
No.
easily send him the files and everything after we've recorded an episode, but he's kind of, yes, he'll still be doing work for his actual job, but he's also like, this is a pleasure trip for him. So I didn't want to make him do extra work on our behalf. So we're going to take next week off, but we'll be back at the first Thursday in June.
Oh,
We're going to go
perfect.
for the summer. And yes, but yes, for us in America, Memorial Day weekend is usually like this kickoff to summer, and there's
Hmm.
all kinds of barbecues and people go to the lake and they start their camping and pools open up, and that's all wonderful and fabulous. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's important that we remember why we're getting this three
Right.
day weekend. So we will begin with, I just want to let folks know we are focusing on two soldiers from World War One, but this applies to all of the wars,
Hmm.
all of the conflicts the US has fought, and the whole reason we created Memorial Day to begin with. With that said, we go into some of the details about what was happening at this point in World War One. There's a lot of the politics I have skipped over and a lot of the details. So for any of our World War One buffs who know more about these events that happened, uh, it's not that I didn't read about them and didn't learn more about them. I just didn't feel like we needed to include the super like detail, super
Intricate.
points. Yeah,
Yeah.
intricate details for our listeners, because really the idea was to focus on the men themselves and their sacrifice as opposed to like all the nitty gritty parts of the battles and the after effects and some of the politics that were involved there. So definitely things we can talk about in other episodes, and I'm sure will come up again. I just wanted to lay out sort of with this episode the ideas of what was going on and the basis for why we were losing certain men at certain times during the First World War.
And the two men that we are focusing on for this episode were very young, and it was something that I noticed when because I take all the services out at Evergreen, and so I have time to look at who's around me, and I'm looking at and in the area where Matt there was many, World War II veterans that were laid to rest in 2018, 2005, etc. And I think most of us see them as older men, bent, oftentimes in wheelchairs, especially for World War II because they were so much older. But then I start looking at their birth dates, 1920, 1921. These men were only and many of these conflicts, of course, were 19, 20, 21 at best. So, when we think about our veterans, think about they were kids. They were young. They were basically kids. And we can say that because I know I'm older than Jenny, but anyone under 30 is a kid. Um, these were kids. And then as you're listening to this, think about your own kids, your own grandkids. They weren't old men who fought these wars.
And even though these, especially in the first two world wars and conflicts before that, I know to some degree our men and our young women were
Yes.
more mature in some ways than maybe our young men and women are at the same age now, because of the way they lived their lives. They
Right.
obviously they were living a very different style of life, and they were, in this case, the two men that we're talking about were both laborers
Mhm.
before they joined the army, but um, they were still very young. In this case, these two men that we're going to tell you today about didn't have a chance to get married, didn't have a chance to fall in love, didn't have a chance to have their own children. And so often in war, that's what happens. The men that are picked to fight are the young, strong, healthy men who can withstand the hardships of war and hopefully come out on the other side, but who oftentimes don't.
George Wasinger, November 14th, 1918.
John Wysowatcky Jr., October 23rd, 1918. These are just two of the estimated 116,708 Americans who did not return home after the end of the First World War, and of the over 8 million who fought from all nations involved. George and John were young men leading normal, everyday lives when duty called and took them from their homes and families. While both men were born and raised in the U.S., their parents had come to this country hoping to escape persecution and poverty in Russia and Poland. By serving as soldiers for the U.S., perhaps they hoped their families would finally be considered Americans and be given opportunities that were often denied to those whose culture and religions were often looked down upon.
We know very little of the personal stories of each of these men, but we are grateful for their greatest sacrifice, their lives, for the freedom of others. By the time America entered World War I in 1917, the rest of Europe and its allies had been fighting since the summer of 1914. When war was first declared, President Woodrow Wilson was determined that America should remain neutral, saying in part, "The people of the United States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly from the nations now at war. It is natural and inevitable that there should be the utmost variety of sympathy and desire among them with regard to the issues and circumstances of the conflict. Some will wish one nation, others another, to succeed in the momentous struggle. And I venture, therefore, my fellow countrymen, to speak a solemn word of warning to you against that deepened, most subtle, most essential breach of neutrality which may spring out of partisanship, out of passionately taking sides. The United States must be neutral, in fact, as well as a name during these days that are to try men's souls. We must be impartial in thought as well as in action, must put a curb upon our sentiments as well as upon every transaction that might be construed as a preference of one party to the struggle before another."
Now, of course, this was the president's personal feelings on this, and it's what he presented to Congress for several years. It didn't necessarily mean everybody in the US
Right.
was in favor of this neutrality. But he knew that because at that point we had had so many immigrants from all of these countries that were involved. He was trying really hard to say we don't really want what's happening over there to be happening on our soil as well. However, it was nearly impossible for many living on US soil to remain neutral, as the president requested. Beginning in the 1870s and throughout the early 1900s, thousands of men, women, and children had come to America in search of better lives, at the same time leaving behind family and friends. Their customs, religions, and way of life came with them, and they formed tight knit communities across the United States. As tensions escalated in Europe, these communities found themselves caught between their loyalty to their new homeland and their ties to their countries of origin. Many German Americans, for instance, faced growing hostility and suspicion, while those of British and French descent were often vocal in their support for the Allied causes.
Germany's submarine attacks on the Atlantic kept tensions high. The sinking of the British ship the Lusitania on May 7, 1915, killed over 1,100 men, women, and children. 103 of them American citizens, and sparked outrage in the U.S. 2 years later, Germany's continued attack on British, French, and American ships and meddling in U.S.-Mexican relations led the U.S. to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917, joining the Allied forces. At that time, however, the United States Army had less than 100,000 men serving in its rank. The National Guard only has slightly higher numbers at about 115,000 men. But even combined, these numbers were too small to make even a slight dent in assisting the Allies. President Wilson wanted an army of 1 million. He had high hopes that men from coast to coast would be willing to volunteer. But just 6 weeks after declaring war, only about 73,000 men had willingly joined the ranks. With numbers so small, it became necessary to create the draft. According to the National Archives Foundation, on May 18, 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which authorized the federal government to temporarily expand the military through conscription. The act eventually required all men between the ages of 21 to 45 to register for military service. Under the act, approximately 24 million men registered for the draft. Of the total U.S. troops sent to Europe, 2.8 million men had been drafted and 2 million men had volunteered.
They actually expanded that age range a few weeks after it initially began to include 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. So originally they said 21 and older, and then they lowered the age limit to get more young men on board. But that came several weeks after the first round of the draft happened. June 5th, 1917 became known as Registration Day. Printed in papers across the country, more than 10 million young Americans enrolled themselves today for war service. Registration Day, with but a few weeks of preparation, saw the first military census ever taken in the United States completed without a single untoward event of consequence. The manhood of the nation obeyed the president's call and volunteered en masse, settling at naught all schemes and plottings of German sympathizers and the few cranks who have agitated against registration. It remains but to select the men who are to go to the front. Among those men were John Wysowatcky Jr. and George Wasinger. In September of 1917, John and George, both young men in good health, were sent to Camp Funston at Fort Riley, Kansas, to begin their training. Both served in the Army's 89th Division, 354th Infantry. John was assigned to Company G, while George was a member of Company M.
George Wasinger was born on April 3, 1895, in Salina, Kansas. His parents, Joseph and Elizabeth Wasinger, came to the United States from Graf, Russia, one of the German Catholic colonies, also known as Volga Germans or Germans from Russia, that was formed under the rule of Catherine the Great. However, by the 1870s, the people in these colonies were being discouraged to continue their German traditions under the rule of Alexander III. This forced many to leave Russia, seeking religious freedom in America. Joseph and Elizabeth immigrated in 1888 with their 3 oldest boys, Charles, Julian, and Florin, and settled on a farm in Kansas. The family would have 5 more children, Catherine, John, Andrew, George, and Eugene. Sadly, Catherine, Andrew, and Eugene all died as infants. By the time George filled out his draft card in 1917, the family had relocated to Byers, Colorado, a rural community east of Denver. He was a young man of medium height and build with light brown hair and blue eyes, who was used to doing heavy farm labor.
John Wysowatcky Jr. was born July 25th, 1893, to Polish immigrants John Wysowatcky Sr. and his wife Mary in Denver, Colorado. John was the third child and first boy for the couple. Their other children included Anna, Rose, Julia, Arthur, Andrew, Helen, Anastasia, who went by Nettie, and Mary. John Sr. came to the U.S. in late 1895 or early 1896, determined to make something of himself before sending for his fiancée. 2 years later, 1888, John was able to pay Mary's way from Poland, and she joined him in Denver, Colorado, where the couple married on April 26, 1888. The couple settled in an area of North Denver known for many years as Globeville, where many others from Poland and other Eastern European countries had created a community. The family was active in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and John Sr. worked for the Globe Smelting and Refining Company. The family would live in the area for more than 50 years. In fact, John Jr.'s younger brother, Andrew, would become a well-known Denver area attorney. When John Jr. was drafted, he was working as a butcher for the large meatpacking plant, also located in Globeville. His draft card listed his physical description as short, with a medium build, dark brown hair, and brown eyes.
When enlisted, men first arrived at Camp Funston. Items such as uniforms and weapons were in very short supply in the U.S. and hadn't had time to get it all produced. Lieutenant Colonel George H. English, Jr. writes an amusing story in his book, History of the 89th Division, USA, about how the commanding officers overcame some of these challenges. Uniforms were not forthcoming. Very well, said General Wood to his supply officers. Go out and buy blue denim overalls for all. These will all look alike and will cover the body, which essentially is all that a uniform can do. There were no rifles. Very well, said General Wood. Let them whittle rifles out of wood. These would do for them to learn the manual of arms and to get the knack of coming to a halt with a 1, 2, and a 1, 2, 3.
And so presently, comical blue denim columns began to wind over the hills. Many an officer used to better things had to make violent efforts to suppress a titter when a ludicrous sentry in campaign hat and with overalls turned up a mile at the bottom, came solemnly to a present with a wooden gun. Comical, ludicrous, you say? Well, only at first sight. When the officer came in actual contact with these men and began to command them, there came an appreciation of what lay under the uncouth exterior. These men, taken, as some thought, against their own will from peaceful pursuits, were found to be responding to the national will. Sober, undemonstrative, cool, and sound in body, wholesome in mind, they were willingly and cheerfully and uncomplainingly making the best of things in order to fit themselves for a great task, and were deliberately making themselves into the finest individual soldiers in the world. The thrill that followed the realization of the true character of the American soldier has never departed from many an officer, and recurs whenever he sees a body of troops on the march or thinks of what they have endured and what they have accomplished.
Recruits, many of whom were barely out of their teens, were thrust into a world of discipline and rigor. They were pushed to their limits, learning the fundamentals of soldiering, from marching and rifle training to first aid and trench warfare tactics. The days were long and physically demanding, with recruits often rising before dawn for exercise and drilling on the parade ground. Despite the hardships, the training was designed to prepare them for the brutal realities of war, and many recruits emerged from boot camp feeling tougher, more confident, and ready to face whatever lay ahead. And what lay ahead was more than any of them could actually imagine.
The biggest thing being that they were training for this trench warfare, which none of our soldiers had ever dealt with before. That was new for World War I. 9 months after leaving their families and civilian lives, John, George, and the others of the 89th Division, men from Missouri, Kansas, Colorado, Nebraska, South Dakota, Arizona, and New Mexico, boarded trains that took them east to New York, where some boarded ships that left from that city's harbor. Those serving in the 354th continued their train ride further north to Montreal, Canada. Both John and George's companies were loaded onto a British troop transport ship called the Escanes, which sailed first to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and then to London. They set sail on June 6, 1918, exactly 1 year from the day they registered to serve the United States Army. Once they arrived in London, the men were sent to rest camps in different areas for a few days before being sent to Southampton, where they would cross the Channel into France at the end of June.
Once in France, the new troops began super intensive training just behind the battle lines. Lieutenant Colonel George H. English Jr. wrote, "After playing with dummies at Camp Funston, the men were now given real grenades that exploded when they were thrown. All the infantry troops had a turn at occupying a network of practice trenches where they'd learn to construct and repair entanglements, to snipe at sawdust enemies, to make camouflage, to execute trench raids, and to stand to for an enemy attacked. Imaginary battles were staged daily, long, furious battles that could only be decided by the Empire."
When July 4th rolled around, rumors of a grand parade in Paris reached the division. But back in the training area, the holiday was marked with a more low-key festivity, speeches, and baseball games. A more formal ceremony took place at division headquarters where the mayor and residents of Raynal gathered to thank the Americans for their support in the war. This gesture was reciprocated 2 weeks later when the American Expeditionary Forces celebrated Bastille Day on July 14th, honoring France's national holiday and marking that country's historic liberation.
One of the first major tests for the regiment came on the night of August 7th, when they were hit with a surprise gas bombardment, causing around 700 casualties. Despite being new to the front lines and struggling with gas mask discipline, the troops showed remarkable courage and determination, holding their positions despite the intense attack. The 98th Division would go on to play a key role in the Saint-Mihiel offensive, launching a major attack in September against entrenched German forces. The Allied forces aimed to capture the strategic Saint-Mihiel salient, blocking the German communication with Verdun, and ultimately targeting the German railroad center at Metz. It was the first large-scale operation led by the U.S. Army in World War I and was the U.S.'s first major victory of the war.
Yeah, so they didn't waste much time after they got over there trying to get things done. While the victory of Saint-Mihiel offensive was a morale booster, the end of the war was not yet in sight. Beginning on September 26, 1918, and lasting for 47 days, the Allied forces pushed to devastate the German forces with a plan called the Meuse-Argonne Offense. According to archives.gov, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive was the largest operation of the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I, with over 1 million American soldiers participating. It was also the deadliest campaign in American history, resulting in over 26,000 soldiers being killed in action and over 120,000 total casualties. Indeed, the number of graves in the American military cemetery at Romange is far larger than those in the more commonly known site at Omaha Beach in Normandy. On October 23rd, the 28th day of the campaign, Private John Wysowatcky Jr. was killed in action. He was 25 years old.
On the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the conflict called the Great War came to an official end inside a train car on the outskirts of Compiègne, France, where the Allied powers signed a ceasefire, otherwise known as an armistice agreement with Germany. Germany was the last of the Central Powers to agree to end the war.
However, just because an agreement was reached, that didn't mean all weapons were immediately laid to rest. According to an article written by Tara Finn and published on gov.uk, General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, did not approve of the armistice. Consequently, he gave no instructions to his commanders to suspend any new offensive action during the remaining hours until 11 a.m. This gave individual commanders latitude to determine their actions in the last few hours, and in some quarters, there was fierce fighting up to 11 a.m., which was difficult to stop because the signing of the armistice actually happened at 5 o'clock in the morning, so several hours before. On 11 November alone were nearly 11,000 casualties, dead, missing, and injured, exceeding those on D-Day in 1944. Over 3,500 of these were American. Pershing had to face a congressional hearing to explain why there were so many deaths when the hour of the armistice was known in advance, because they knew like 2 days before that this was going to happen. It was on the day peace was declared that George Wasinger was injured during fighting. He died 3 days later, November 14th, 1918, in a field hospital. He was just 23 years old.
The horrors of war didn't end on the battlefield. Evan P. Sullivan's 2019 article on nursingcleo.org details what it was like to bring the remains of those who died overseas back to the U.S. The Grave Registration Service, the GRS, created in 1917, was responsible for identifying, exhuming, and registering the bodies of American dead in over 2,300 temporary cemeteries across Europe. By 1919, Americans grew impatient that their loved ones hadn't yet been returned, and letters flooded the War Department. In March of that year, the department sent 74,770 ballots to families, letting them decide the fate of their relative's body. By January 1920, they received over 63,000 replies. Most were wanting their loved ones buried on American soil. Among them were the Wysowatcky and Wasinger families. George's remains left France on November 29, 1920, and arrived stateside on December 15th. On January 13, 1921, the Rocky Mountain News reported the funeral of George Wasinger of Byers, Colorado, who died in France, will be held Monday morning from St. Elizabeth's Church. Burial will be in Mount Olivet Cemetery. Wasinger, who was 23 years old, was wounded Armistice Day and died 4 days later in a field hospital.
John Wysowatcky Jr.'s remains were placed on the USAT Wheaton in France on September 20th, 1921. The Rocky Mountain News printed a notice in their October 22nd, 1921 edition, which said, Private John Wysowatcky died in France while in the service of his country. Beloved son of Mrs. Mary Wysowatcky of 4663 Pennsylvania Street. The funeral services will be held from the late residence Sunday at 1 p.m. Interment will follow at Riverside.
For centuries, the drumbeat of war has echoed through history, claiming the lives of countless young men and women who were sent to fight and die in conflicts, often sparked by the ambitions of others. The pattern is grimly familiar. The young, and often the poor, bear the brunt of the fighting, while the powerful and privileged reap the benefits or avoid the cost altogether. Millions of lives have been lost, their potentials, dreams, and futures brutally truncated, leaving behind only memories of grief. Many had barely begun to explore their passions, build careers, or start families of their own, and yet they were asked to give their last full measure of devotion.
As we observe Memorial Day, it's essential to remember the sacrifices made by all of these men and women who died in combat and the families who loved them. All the John Wysowackis and George Wasingers from every U.S. conflict. Please remember that the 3-day weekend many of us will enjoy in America is meant as a tribute to the immense sacrifices made by those who chose to serve us all. It's a time to reflect on the true meaning of freedom and the price that was paid for it. By honoring their memories, we acknowledge the debt we owe to those who gave everything in hopes of creating a more peaceful and prosperous tomorrow for future generations.
Thank you for joining us today. To learn more about today's episode, visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you'll find additional links in our show notes. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Your support helps others find our show and discover all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories.
You can also follow us on social media for cemetery facts, photos, quotes, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery. If you'd like to help support us financially, you can donate a cup of coffee by clicking on the coffee cup icon on our website or YouTube, or purchase some of our fabulous Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery merchandise through our store link.
Until we meet again.